Trump's an anomaly. He's his own weird thing. He certainly is a troublemaker by temperament to a fair degree and a trickster. And he was very good at that. I mean, look, he was a Democrat, so I don't really know what to make of him.
What was your reaction when you heard about the fact that the 45th president of the United States was being banned permanently in a very powerful virtual government called Twitter?
I thought that companies who are doing such things have no idea what to police the content of what's being exchanged on their networks.
Why do you think opposition doesn't want you to know what he's thinking?
A large part of the American population felt silenced. They're scared he has the power of a demagogue, that he could harness the crowd for nefarious ends. They view him as a Mussolini in the making.
How much of this has to do with your book, Beyond Order, Rule Number 6, Abandon Ideology? I think that's something that we are struggling with as a nation?
Well, people struggle with it all the time because we're attracted to oversimplifications. And it's no wonder, because the complexity of the world is daunting. And some of it's just a matter of not being taught to think well.
Which is kind of where we are today, though. The less we think, the more we can be controlled. My guest today is clinical psychologist, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's been on Valuetainment 2 times before, and he is back for the third. We are very happy to have him. His book in 2018 was ranked #1 in nonfiction in US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, the Netherlands, Brazil, Norway, slated for translation in 50+ languages. That book, 12 Rules for Life That Change Millions of People's Lives. And finally, we decided, let's figure something out to bring him back on. Everybody's excited about his new book that just came out, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. With that being said, Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for being a guest again on Valuetainment.
Good to see you. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
So how are things? How you doing?
Increasingly better.
Increasingly better. That's great to hear.
Yeah. I'm working quite effectively for 3 hours a day now, up from 0. And so 3 hours is a lot more than 0. And I'm working every day for about 3 hours, and I'm starting to expand that. So I've been diagnosed with sleep apnea, very severe sleep apnea. And so I now have a machine to deal with that. And that seems to have helped a lot. I wasn't really sleeping at all, apparently. So that's relevant, and it's been very helpful to have that addressed. And I've adapted to the machine quite rapidly.
Now, has your wife adapted to the machine? Because it's pretty noisy, if it's the one I think it is.
The new ones are very quiet.
Okay, good.
They're very quiet, non-obtrusive, and it's much better than not sleeping.
I got to tell you, I've been watching you on camera the last few months just to see, because you can tell a lot from someone's eyes. The fire looks like it's coming back in those eyes. Your eyes today seem very different than the last few months. It sounds like your energy's coming back up. It seems like the equilibrium's coming back up, if that makes any sense. But just watching you, the way you look right now, you look great.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So obviously, we missed you 2020 and 2019 with the whole catastrophic time that we went through with COVID. I mean, it was a very strange time that we went through. And there was a lot of times where you would turn to see what this person's saying. I said, let me see what he's saying about today's times. What is she saying? What are they saying? It's like, let me see what Jordan's saying. Oh, he's not here with us. While you were going through your phase of, recovery, working on yourself, getting yourself back to where you used to be, how were you sitting there? Were you following the news? Were you following what's going on? Were you sitting there saying, oh my gosh, this is crazy. I got to say something about this. Somebody give me a mic. I want to say something about this, but you couldn't. Did you feel like you were silenced, where you couldn't say anything, or were you just not in a position where you didn't follow the news? You didn't follow anything that was going on?
Well, in 2019, I was preoccupied with my wife's illness, and that just took me out of the public realm pretty much altogether, except when it was absolutely unavoidable, because it was day-to-day catastrophe for months on end. And before that, it was my daughter for a month because she had serious surgery. And so that I was out of public eye and not concerned with public issues for about 9 months then. And then I got very ill. And so I was watching what was going on with COVID. And of course, it was affecting my family and I. We were in Florida for much of that. my parents were with me and my sister and some other family members and now and then some friends. And so we were all affected by that, just as everyone was. But I never really felt that I had anything particularly intelligent to say about COVID. I mean, it's a catastrophe, economically and from the perspective of health. But I didn't feel that I had any insights that were going to be extraordinarily useful to people. I think it was just as well that I kept my mouth shut during that period. And besides that, I was in no shape to craft a careful argument and put it in front of the public. So if I had to miss a year, I suppose this was a pretty good year to miss.
That makes sense. If you had to miss a year, it was a good year to miss.
Yeah, and my son and his wife had a baby. And so that was a blessing in the midst of all this catastrophe. And so when I did want to focus on something that was outside, that was available right there once I got back home. So, that was the positive part of the year for us, or a positive part of the year.
You said when your wife got diagnosed with cancer, is that, if I'm getting the dates right, I don't know, maybe of April of 2019? Is that the right time?
Well, she was actually diagnosed in 2018, but we were told to begin with that it was a common and easily treatable, very slow growing tumor. And then it turned out to be not that at all. It turned out to be something that was fatal in virtually all cases and very rare. And so it was, and then she had a tremendous amount of surgical trauma that lasted for months. That was also life-threatening on a day-to-day basis.
I want to show you something. I want to show you a video of yourself. You and I were together in Las Vegas at the same event where I had the late Kobe Bryant at with President Bush and Jordan Peterson and Billy Bean, if you remember that event. We're at Mirage. There's about 7,000 people there. I'm asking you a question about your kids. And this was your answer and your reaction. And I want to come back and ask you, this is to give you the dates so we can date this. This is July 31st of 2019. So watch the video and then I want to get your reaction from it.
Sure.
Little children pay you back immensely if you have a good relationship with them, if you're on their side and encourage them, because they're an unconditional source of joy and love.
Powerful.
The other thing I noticed that you should all know is that as you get older, your family, the family you've produced, becomes more and more important. So we teach young women in particular that the fundamental goal of their life is going to be their career. And, first of all, most people don't have careers, they have jobs. And those are very different things. But you're not a very happy camper, so to speak, if you're 45 and you have no one, and it doesn't go upwards after that.
That was July 31st, 2019, when I interviewed you, and I walked away. You and I had sat down together once before in Dallas when you came to the office, and we had a great conversation together. I walked away after the interview. I said, this guy's dealing with something. There's something very heavy that he's dealing with right now. And, even upcoming to the event, you said, your wife was going through challenging times and you still made the event. Up until the day, we didn't know if you were going to make it or not, but you were able to make it. And I was very impressed the fact that you made it. But
it was one of the very few events I did that year.
And we were very grateful for it. And you positively impacted a lot of people's lives. Many people made some major decisions in their lives after that, even based on the words that you shared with them. But can you kind of, let us know, where were you at? What were you thinking about on July 31st, 2019?
Well, I mean, I was thinking that there was a high probability that I was going to lose my wife. So that seemed virtually certain. And so and I watched the consequences of that for my kids and her family. And, it brought home to me, and I had been traveling around a lot as well, and seeing people who were lonesome and hurt because their family structure was not what they needed it to be. And so I was also seeing a lot of that and carrying that around in some sense, because I've seen a lot of misery in people as a consequence of all the public lecturing I've been doing, and also just walking around, because people come up to me all the time and tell me about their life in a very open way, very rapidly. And so all of that was affecting me. And I had my own health troubles at the time as well. So, but I think another part of what was affecting me was that while all that was happening, I had a tremendous outpouring of support. There was a tremendous outpouring of support for me and my family from our extended family, who we almost always had someone from our extended family, Tammy's sister or my mother, or Tammy's brother with us. They stayed with us for weeks on end, and my friends as well. And my friends have been unbelievably helpful to me. They've gone way out of their way to help me during this time. Some of them went to Russia when I was there, and came down to Florida to stay for long periods of time. And then also the same thing happened on the public level. We had hundreds of letters. Well, Tammy was in the hospital. My sister printed those out in color and put them up in the hospital room. And that was really helpful. And I think it affected my last book too, because the book has a more communitarian ethos than the first one. I've become much more sensitive to the cooperative role that people play in making each other better. And because I do believe that each individual in some sense is obligated to work towards their own salvation, so to speak. And you can think about that agnostically if you want. You need to do good in the world, and it's the most rewarding possible thing to do. And your conscience tortures you if you don't do that, and that's very unpleasant. And so everyone in the deepest part of them, they're highly motivated to make things better. And that is something you do individually, but it's also something that you do with a tremendous amount of help. And you can also be helpful to others. And I've seen so much of that. So many people were so helpful to us that it just shocked me. And that includes the public, the members, because I didn't know, for example, when I came back in November, because that's sort of when I started re-entering public life to some degree, I had no idea how I would be treated. And I was ambivalent about the morality of my illness, because, what's been broadly reported was that I developed a dependence on benzodiazepines, which is true, but I was also extremely ill before I took them, which is why I took them to begin with. And I still don't know why that was exactly. I haven't figured that out or know if it's going to go away, but it's certainly been the case that people have been unbelievably helpful. And so all of that was in my mind when I was talking on stage. It's always on my mind, I suppose.
Yeah, and obviously the tour you did, we're talking about 160 cities. I don't know how many countries you went to, 500,000 tickets sold. You went all over the world. You were on tour regularly, traveling, going all over the place. What was tougher for you? Was it tougher for you to come out and tell the world what you were struggling with, or was it tough to come back from that? Because your image, when we think about the image of Jordan Peterson, it's values, it's principles. It's what many men see an example like, I want to be like this man one day, that I want to be able to follow a strong example of somebody like him. Was it tougher for you to come out and tell the world I'm dealing with this addiction? Or was it more, when I come back, how is the world going to receive me? Are they going to welcome me? Which one was tougher for you?
Oh, I think they were both almost insufferably tough. And I wasn't really in a position to defend myself in some sense, because I didn't know exactly what had happened to me. I still really don't know. But I'd already decided at that point, long before that point, that the way to deal with complex issues is just to say what you think about them. I wasn't trying to craft a message that would ease my reentrance into the public life again. I was trying to pick up the pieces of my life and move forward. But I wasn't, I thought uh, how to handle everything that happened. I just said what had happened is to the best of my ability. And that is what I try to do. I'm not trying to craft a message for a particular purpose. Other than maybe I'm hoping that I'm trying to make things better. That's a purpose, but it's kind of abstract in some sense. But what I'm doing apart from that is just trying to say what I believe to be the case at the moment. And I've really been thinking about that a lot lately too, because like I have a formal technique for my lectures, hey? So when I sit down to give a lecture, I sit down for 20 minutes beforehand. I have to be alone and I have to go into kind of a reverie. And so I relax and then I think, okay, well, what problem am I going to talk about tonight? And I don't mean that I'm going to supply an answer. What I'm going to do is to try to push my thinking about the answer to that problem and the problem itself, how it should be formulated, farther than I've managed to push it so far. And then I think, well, here's the ideas that I can draw on to walk through that process of problem specification and analysis, and then we'll just see what happens. We'll see how that goes. And so then it's spontaneous thought that's happening on stage. I use pieces of things that I've already thought up, but that doesn't matter. They're combined in an original way to the degree that I can do that in real time. And I think the reason that engrosses the audience is partly because it is a genuine attempt to further an exploration of truth, at least insofar as I can formulate it. And then it's also in some sense like a story, because I can lay out an argument from start to end and everyone can follow along with it. And then I've been trying to figure out what I'm doing in podcasts or what podcasts are good for. And I think it's exactly the same thing, in that they're a real revolutionary replacement for standard mainstream media journalistic interviews, for example. When a podcast really works, you tell me what you think about this. I mean, my experience is that when a podcast really works, you have two people who are exploring a set of concepts mutually, and they're engaged in a genuine process of the exchange of ideas. So it's dialectical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's real-time dialectical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of it as it's a manifestation of the logos, all things considered. And that's compelling because it's so useful. And so it's compelling because something might come out of it in terms of clarification of a problem and maybe the generation of a solution. But it's also useful as an example conversation. And so, well, I was hoping when I came back to public life that I could continue doing that. And so far that seems to be working, and I'm starting to write again. And although that's slow, because writing is I find everyone, I think, finds writing very difficult, but it's coming along. And the book has been received very well. So by the public, the critics, the mainstream critics it doesn't really matter, I guess, in some sense, what they think. They think what I would have predicted they thought. And they also seem to, generally speaking, have a fair bit of contempt for my hypothetical audience, which I find quite disquieting. I mean, the caricature of my audience is angry young white men, which isn't true. It's simply not true. My audience does skew somewhat male, but the rest of it's just a caricature. But even if it was the case, I don't see how trying to help those people, the basket of deplorables, let's say, I don't see why that's an immoral endeavor. And I really understand the hostility that's being generated in relationship to maybe to the dispossessed young men, in relationship to the mainstream media, for this kind of contempt. Well, I'm not contemptuous of my audience. I'm thrilled that I can be of use. And I'm trying all the time to figure out how I can be of more use. When someone stops me on the street, and that happens all the time, they're usually shy and tentative about stopping me, and usually very, very polite, almost invariably. So it's never a real imposition. And I always ask people, if they say that they watched a lecture and it helped, I always ask them why, what helped. And so I had 3 guys this week tell me, they said, well, I was comparing myself to what other people had achieved and always coming up short. And that was hurting me. It was making me envious, let's say, and disheartening me. But then I learned to reward myself for small improvements over who I was. And I thought, well, that's really important, because you are comparing yourself to the right person then. And now you're rewarding yourself. You're encouraging yourself for taking the steps that you can take. It's really important to do that right. And, now I know that that's important to my listeners. And so I'll try to formulate that concept more accurately and communicate it more clearly. It's a great privilege. It's a great privilege to be able to do this with the podcasts and the books. And it's great. It's great.
Jordan, let me ask you this. Would you consider yourself happy today?
No.
And when's the last time you were happy?
I was happy a little bit last week for a couple of hours. I'm in too much pain and to be happy still. I mean, it's not like I don't appreciate what's good about my life. I do appreciate it. And I remember it consciously all the time. And my wife and I remind each other about it constantly. And so I see that all very clearly, and I can see where the sources of happiness could lie, but I have a lot of neurological damage by all appearances, and it produces quite a lot of pain. And so I'm overcoming that, I think, bit by bit. Like I have a very structured day. So I get up and I have a sauna, and then I walk for 6 miles, and then I exercise for an hour quite intensely with weights. And I dance a little bit to music because while I'm trying to regain control over all my extremities, and that's all working quite well. And then I have the podcasts and so forth. And so I have a well-structured life, but it's still not to the point where I would say I was happy. I'd like to get there. Healthy really is really what I'd want. Healthy and fully functioning. I'm running at about 50% now, and it was down to about 5 for a long time. So 50 is a lot better.
No, and that's great to hear. What's the longest, like, if you were to put outcomes of a life, like you were to say priorities? Okay, happiness. I'm living a happy life, fulfilled life, healthy life. How would you rank those 3 for someone like you?
Oh, well, healthy is by far the most important. But then I wouldn't use those criteria. Like I think I'm very pleased if I can say things that I believe to be true. I don't think there's anything more rewarding than getting your speech right. And then also seeing what the consequence of that was. And I've been thinking about that a lot too. I've been talking to religious leaders, partly on my podcast, but also thinking it through, because mainstream religious leaders are having a harder and harder time attracting young people to the church. And I don't think that's a good thing, even though I don't attend church. But I was thinking that part of it is that they're not selling a great enough adventure. Like the thing about revolutionary movements like Antifa or Black Lives Matter, something like that, is they offer this unbelievable romance to young people. They can get involved in this fiery cause, and they can go to these romantically spectacular demonstrations. And it's way more exciting than working at 7-Eleven, which I have no contempt for people who work at 7-Eleven, like more power to you. You've got a job and that job needs to be done, but that's not the point. You need an adventure in your life, and these revolutionary movements offer that. But I'm thinking too that, I've written about this, said pursue what's meaningful and not what's expedient. And I would also say that it's useful to say what is true rather than to craft your words so that you get what you want. And part of the reason for that, there's many reasons, but part of the reason for that is that it's unbelievably adventurous. You have no idea what will happen if you just say what you think. And my experience has been that the consequences are absolutely overwhelming, always, constantly. And, when I go into a talk like this, I don't have an outcome in mind. I don't want to make a fool of myself. I don't want to say something stupid. I want to engage in an interesting conversation, but but I'm not trying, I don't have an agenda other than that, but it's just to say what I feel in the moment as clearly as I possibly can. It's so adventurous to do that. And it's far better than pursuing a more narrow goal that might be wrong. And so there's an adventure there that, and I think one of the things I love about the long form video format is that it enables people to engage in the mutual exploration of truth, a revelation of truth, the discovery of truth. And it's so interesting too that people find that compelling and exciting and watch it and want it. And it's revolutionary, I think, and it's a privilege to be part of that.
You know why I
Try to
ask
get
you this
better at
question?
it.
I ask you this question for one reason. Like, I think about when I watch you and Michaela together, right? And I have a daughter. I have a 4-year-old daughter. I have a 7-year-old son and a 9-year-old son, right? I mean, a kid wants their mommy and daddy to be happy. That's why they make them laugh. That's why they win. That's why they put grades. They want mommy and daddy to be happy, right? I think, okay, what does Michaela want of Pops? You know, I bet Michaela probably wants dad to be happy, you know, in next phase of life. So, you know, what, two questions here on the topic of happiness. What makes Jordan happy? And when was the last time you had the longest stretch of happiness? What caused it? Those two questions, I'm curious.
Oh, I had a lot of happiness, I would say, when I was on tour.
Okay.
It was unbelievably exciting. I had some health problems during that period of time too. So
Sure.
there was a shadow there, but that made me happy on a continual basis. It was unbelievably exciting and engaging. I mean, people are happy when they're pursuing something that they find meaningful, deeply meaningful, especially when that's going well. On a day-to-day level, I find most of my happiness, I would say, well, in engaging conversation, that's for sure, but also with my family. And, you know, that's partly why I said what I did say when in that clip that you showed earlier. You know, what makes me most happy right now is when my family gets together. So that's my immediate family, my wife, my kids, and their spouses. And there's no there's nothing buried underneath the rugs, and everyone's joking and laughing and playing, and it's peaceful. It's truly peaceful, and that does happen. I go to see my son quite often. He lives just up the street from me, fortunately enough, and I really like his wife. And Jillian is her name, and Jillian and my wife Tammy have really tried to make their relationship, to perfect their relationship, to get rid of any, you know, of the cliched mother-in-law, daughter-in-law trouble. And some of that was there to begin with, and they both decided, and I suppose we all decided consciously as a unit that we're going to get rid of all of that and just stop it and try to have a really good relationship. And that really worked. And so now I go over there, and they're happy, they're smiling, it's peaceful there. Their little boy is laughing. He's playing with laughing. And so we had some people over for Easter dinner, my son and his wife and a couple of friends of theirs. And they had a little baby named Florence. And she was also the same age, and she was playing with laughing. So she would go, ha, 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 ha. And then my grandson, Elliot, would go, ha, 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 ha. And then all the adults would laugh because these two infants were actually having a conversation with each other, a proto conversation with laughter. That lasted for about 10 minutes, and everyone was laughing about it. And well, there isn't anything better than that when there isn't all sorts of horror hidden underneath the carpets. You know, in this new book, Beyond Order, I have a chapter called Don't Hide Things in the Fog. And it's about this. It's like wonderful things can happen if you straighten out everything that's hidden in a family and get it out in the open. And then you have the opportunity then for some real peace and some real joy. And certainly that's at the moment where it's in those interpersonal interactions that I derive a lot of my happiness. And that's been life-saving. And then, of course, this active, engaged intellectual conversation, the sort of conversation that we're doing our best to have, that's also, and the fact that I can share that with so many people, and the responses are so positive. It's wonderful. It's amazing. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. It's so ridiculous.
Well, we enjoy it probably just as much as you do, if not more than you do. You know, the audience enjoys it way more than you probably do, because we're learning and we're figuring out our lives out. But You know, I'm going to a place with these series of questions I'm asking you. Years ago, my dad told me something very interesting. I was a 1.8 GPA kid in high school. I aced math. I loved math. I loved numbers. Everything else, I had no tolerance for it. I had no patience. Didn't have the happiest life. You know, we leave Iran. We go to Germany. I live at a refugee camp for a couple of years. I just couldn't wait to get away from reality. So I went and joined the army to get some kind of an escape. I get out of the army and I'm thinking about being a bodybuilder to be the next Arnold. And then all of a sudden, I start reading books. And in my entire lifetime, I read 2 books. One of them was That Was Then, This Is Now. The other one was Of Mice of Men. And I didn't even finish it. It was in high school. I was never a reader. I started reading a book and then the next one and then the next one. Jordan, it got to a point that I just couldn't put books down. And I wouldn't go out Friday nights. And I was a big party guy. I was in Vegas every other weekend for a year. I was always at the nightclubs Tuesday through Sunday. Monday's the only day that I would generally take off, or Wednesdays I would take off. But I was going 6 nights a week. And then my dad's like, what's up with this reading? I said, Dad, let me tell you, man, this information is ridiculous. Can you imagine like what's in this book? In this book, I learned this. In this book, in this article, in this book. So you would never read it. Why reading so much? I said, I'm obsessed. He says, let me give you a tip. He says, what's that? He says, in my life, I have 2 people. One of them is a guy named Albert, who is like an uncle to me, sweetheart of a guy. The guy, you know, just, you'll love this guy. He would come to our house, didn't speak English at the time. I would watch Kings of Comedy, and Bernie Mac would be doing a skit, and he is laughing so hard, Jordan, almost as if he has to go to the bathroom. I'm like, did you just understand what he said? He says, I have no clue what he said, but it's so funny. I said, you don't know what he just said. He said, I have no clue. It's just funny. So my dad says, look at Albert, a happy simpleton. Okay. Look how much he's enjoying his life. Okay. Happiest guy to be around. You go eat with him. You give him good food. He's happy. People dance. He's happy. Telling stories. He's happy. Just a happy guy that's enjoying life. He said, now let me tell you about my brother, younger brother, my dad's brother, physicist, 6'5". Guy couldn't stop reading books, pipe, cigar, you know, one of those thinkers. He would read, and he couldn't stop. Like he would read physics books, like he would read chemistry books on his own. Like it wasn't homework or anything. Just you'd go to his place. He had all these weird books and he was doing mathematical homeworks on his own. He said, the moment you get caught with the reading, with the bug of reading and learning, and you get addicted to it, you have to know that your mind is going to process stuff, and the debate starts happening here, and it's forever. It never stops. He said, you lose a little bit of happiness when you go too much about wanting to get certain questions answered in life, because it's never going to end. It's forever. He says, so if you choose to subscribe to wanting to become a lifelong learner, be also ready to lose a part of that happiness and freedom that you once had when you didn't know everything. Now, you and I may say, I wouldn't want to live that life. I mean, what are you talking about? I don't want to be controlled by other people. I don't want to be naive where I just look at the media. Oh, okay, vote this way. Okay, okay, do this way. Oh, they're the bad people. Oh, you're right. They're the bad people. I don't want to be that person. But there's a part of it where you're like, you know, is that the life kind of I want to live? Am I going to miss the freedom, the special small things that used to make me be happy? Now I can't even enjoy the small stuff that I used to. Do you ever catch yourself asking, oh man, maybe I'm in too deep of being this worried genius, and I've lost a bit of my happy simpleton.
Yeah, well, I certainly experienced that when my health broke down. And the reason for that was that I not only did I get sick, my life fell apart because I couldn't do anything that I used to be able to do. I couldn't listen to music. I couldn't read. I couldn't write. I couldn't think. I couldn't do any of them because everything that I had done was complex and difficult, all the things that I engaged in. And what I did realize was that that left me vulnerable on a certain front, because if I wasn't in peak health, let's say, I wouldn't be able to do those things. And so, I mean, that's why I'm walking now, for example. You know, I said I walk 6 miles a day, and I do that every day. It's very simple. And I've played a lot of ping pong, and I've always liked that, but I never played that much, but I liked that. And there is some utility in having things around that are rewarding and good for you, that are less complex. I would say, though, that with regards to the conflict between, let's say, you know, miserable wisdom and happy ignorance, is that there's different forms of rewards to be found in different places. You can think about this even in terms of personality. One major personality dimension is extroversion. And the reason for that is that we have a pleasure circuit, and how active that is varies between people. That's what causes variation in extroversion. And we generally equate happiness with the activation of the circuitry that's associated with extroversion. And drugs like cocaine and amphetamines activate that circuit. But there's another personality dimension, which is openness. And openness is the creativity dimension. And there's pleasure to be derived from that as well. And so that's philosophical exploration and literary experience. And I suppose when you go to a movie, you experience a blend of those two things, especially if it's a rather complex movie. So there's different forms of engagement or pleasure to be found, and some of them are more akin to happiness, and some of them are more akin to meaning. And sometimes they come into conflict, but I think all things considered, they work best when they're working together. And I do strive diligently to and I think that this has really been brought home to me. Look, I couldn't sit down. I literally couldn't sit down for almost a year. And so I lost the ability to sit down. I had fantasies for hours of being able to sit by a fireplace and just not move, because I had this condition called akathisia, which is, I learned how valuable it is to be able to sit down. And now when I sit down and nothing is happening, I'm taking stock of that and noticing what an unbelievable gift that is. And it is really useful to maintain your ability to see what you have that you've taken for granted, because you can lose everything. You can lose things you don't even know you have. I had no idea that you could ever lose the ability just to sit down, but you can. I wouldn't recommend it. So I'm more appreciative, I would say, of simpler things than I was. I'm more appreciative of other people than I was. I'm probably more grateful, all things considered, than I was. And hopefully that will continue developing. I have no contempt for happiness. I tell people, don't pursue happiness, pursue meaning. And I think that's true. But if happiness comes along, it should be welcomed. And if you're ever somewhere where that's happening, you should notice it and be grateful for it and enjoy it. And that's for sure.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes the world sets an expectation of who you are, and you constant compliments? Oh my gosh, Jordan, let me tell you changed my life. Oh my gosh, Jordan, you don't even know what your book did to me. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh, you have no idea. Because of you, I'm doing that. Because of you, my marriage worked. Because of you, I have a better relation with my dad. Because of you, I'm doing better with my mom. Because of you, because of you, because of you. Sometimes that because of you, it's a little too much burden of because of you. It's like, dude, because of me, don't do shit. Like, because of me, just let me be free for once. Like, because of you, like, maybe I don't want you to say because of you. Look, go live your life. Look, because of you, you made the decision. I'm just writing a book. Do you ever feel like you don't want that standard and expectation of, putting you on the pedestal here, and then you have to almost walk on water where you're not free? Do you ever feel that kind of an obligation, or no, that's not even something that crosses your mind?
I feel that obligation all the time.
Got it.
And I have people around right from the beginning of all this. I've talked to my friends and my family all the time about what I'm doing so that I don't make a mistake, so that we're trying to stop me from making a mistake. So, but I also, especially when I'm talking to people one-on-one, I don't want, see, if you're a clinical psychologist, you don't want to steal people's accomplishments from them, which is partly why you don't give advice exactly. So maybe someone is trying to decide whether they should get married, and maybe you have an opinion, but probably you shouldn't, because as a psychologist, let's say, because except perhaps in extreme cases, the person has to discover what they need to do for themselves so that they can discover it again in the future, so that they can learn to discover things for themselves. And you don't want to give advice, because then if they do something good, you can take credit for it. And I don't want to take credit for the accomplishments that people make as a consequence of, what would you say, putting the ideas they encounter in my books into practice. They put them into practice, and good for them. And so when I meet people in the street, that's what I tell them. It's like, okay, you did this specific thing. Good for you. And, I provided some impetus, and I'm happy about that and pleased to do that. But I certainly don't want the credit. But I do feel the obligation. I think it is part of what made me ill. I think it is because, as a psychologist, I dealt with people's innermost secrets for decades. But it was kind of limited, right? It was 13 people or so a week, maybe up to 20, which is still quite a few people, but it's not an inordinate number of people. It's a bounded number of people. And then I had my other work that I could escape into, let's say, and I wasn't carrying it with me, the burden of the lives of the people that I was intertwined with. But then all of a sudden I started to experience that the longing, I suppose, in some sense, on a much greater scale. And that's been difficult to digest. The misery and that's so common in people's lives. But even worse than that, the degree to which it requires almost nothing to rectify it in an important way. There's many people who are starving for a word of encouragement. And if you provide that, they run with it. And that's great, but it also reveals this terrible unnecessary lack. It's like, well, why weren't they encouraged to begin with? And that's a deep hole to fall down. And, because you can never stop answering that question once you start asking it. And, it has something to do with the fundamental difficulty that everyone who's human has in valuing their own existence because of its imperfections and finitude. And it's a very complex question. And then to see that played out thousands of times, these brief encounters I have with people, they're very intense. People tell me things in those encounters that they don't tell anyone else, or they tell very few people, or maybe they've never told anyone in their life. And I can see too, this young man stopped me on the street the other day, and he was looking a bit beat up. And he came up and he said, he was very shy, and he said, well, your lectures have been very helpful. And I asked him what his name was, and that usually helps people set them at ease. And then I said, well, what helped you? And he was quite hesitant. He didn't exactly know how to formulate what he was doing, but I could see that he was very scared to say anything that he had done well, because his experience had been that he'd never been encouraged when he did something well. And so, you can really punish someone if they come up to you and say they did something good that was actually good, and then you punish them or ignore them. It really hurts them. And that happens to children all the time. And it certainly had happened to this young man. So he's very hesitant to tell me what he had done that was good. And, he told me, and I listened, and I said, look, this is, as far as I'm concerned, that what you did was really good. And he just lit up, it was, and that's great that he lit up, but it's terrible that it hadn't happened to him before. It's really terrible. And then I see this tied in with a cultural pathology, that a variety of cultural pathologies that are manifesting themselves at the current time. The idea that organized masculine activity is by definition some kind of power-centered tyranny, and the corollary that any sort of ambition on the part of young men any ambition towards achievement is somehow integrally tied up with tyrannical power. It's so demoralizing for young men. They don't know how to defend themselves against that. And the idea, and it's often leveled, the accusation is often leveled by people who've never had a relationship with a male in their life that was actually fulfilling and worthwhile. And then that all plays out in the public domain. It's really awful to see. And I can see it. So it's hard. It's hard to see that. I mean, I'm thrilled that I am in a position to do something about it. It's so great. That's something else I can tell people now too, because you say, well, what should you do with your life? And I've seen people who've accomplished anything that you can imagine in terms of accomplishments. And I can say clearly that I've never seen anything as rewarding as the consequences of forthright speech, the opportunity to be of genuine service to other people. There's way more reward in that than in any of the things that people chase in a more finite and limited way.
You know, Jordan, when you're going through that phase, normally for a person to come out of a place we are that we've never been before, we need some kind of a source of inspiration, right? So,
Yeah.
And we like to find someone to say, well, that's my hero. Like I have a painting in my office called Dead Mentors. It's me in the painting with 8 other characters in a vault. We're having a conversation. It's a debate between 2 books, Communist Manifesto and Atlas Shrugged. So it's a discourse. They're having a debate, they're having a discourse. It's very interesting characters.
Mm-hmm.
But you can tap into somebody. You're like, okay, I can tap.
Who are the characters? Who are the characters in the painting?
Let me. I just moved to Florida, so I got John F. Kennedy, I got Einstein, I got the Shah of Iran, Lincoln, MLK, Tupac, Ayrton Senna, Milton Friedman, and one other character I'm forgetting.
Great. So that's so good, because look, and you can surround yourself with these great minds, and you can what would you say, in some sense, you can choose them as your peers,
Mm-hmm.
voluntarily, dead or not, right? It's a form of ancestor worship in some sense. And I mean that in a deep sense. And you can do that's one of the advantages of that is education, as far as I'm concerned, is pick your peers. And yeah, and this instinct we have to find someone to admire, that's the deepest of religious instincts, and it's unbelievably deep in human beings. And and we have this mimicry, this capacity for mimicry that's an integral part of our cognitive architecture, and it's the precursor to thought. And we do identify, you notice you admire someone, that is the instinct to mimic, because to admire is then to want to be that, and that's the action of the moral instinct. It finds a target in the world and it says, well, I could be like that. But at first it says, this person is attractive, or this person is compelling. It grabs you. And that's the instinct for further development. It's a very positive thing. It can be a very positive thing.
Who'd you tap into? Was it a biblical figure? Was it a philosopher? Was it a leader? Was it a political leader? When you were going through your moment the last 12 months, who were you saying, at least he overcame it, I can? Here's what he went through was worse. Was there anybody you would go to?
Well, there has been throughout my life all sorts of intellectual figures, figures from my own life as well. I found many things about my father extremely admirable, and still do. My mother as well. And so I was fortunate to have people in my immediate environment who played that role for me, and that's a huge gift. I have all sorts of intellectual idols, I would say, and there are people whose work I've read deeply, and that's been extremely useful to me. And then that shades into the consideration of religious figures at some point. And I've spent a lot of time studying religious thinking and trying to, what religious thinking is in some sense is the collective attempt to specify the ideal for mimicry. So imagine that you have those 8 figures in your painting. So imagine there's something about each of those people that you found compelling and admirable. So then imagine that you could abstract out from that what was compelling and admirable, and make one person out of that was sort of the union of all those 8. It was everything good about those 8 people brought into one person. Well, that's approaching a divine figure. And when you hear Christian statements, for example, like Christ is the King of Kings, that actually means something technical from a psychological perspective. What it means is that, and I'm not speaking in religious terms here precisely, although it shades into the religious, is that a religious ideal is, in fact, the abstracted representation of what is admirable as such. And it's extremely useful to have that made into an abstraction to some degree too, because it also means that you then have something that you're responsible to. So let's say and you've done this with your painting, you have these 8 people who you're now, what would you say? You're responsible to them. You're accountable to them. You're accountable to their spirit. And so now your conscience can speak with their collective voice, and it can tell you when you're less than you could be. And then you can use that to guide you to manifest that spirit that's embodied in those 8 people. And that's a pathway to further growth. And it's something that we're hypothetically, in all of our conversations, when we're demanding from one another that we respond properly, we're trying to evoke that ideal from ourselves and from other people. We're constantly doing that. That's partly why I love podcasts, because that can really happen in real time. Like I just released a conversation with Jocko Willink today where I think that happened for much of the conversation. And as I get healthier, I'm hoping that will work better. And to the degree that we're doing the right thing at the moment, we're doing our best to manifest that abstracted ideal. And the other thing that's so remarkable about that is that as long as we do it, the better we do it, the more compelling we're going to find the conversation. The time will disappear. We'll get absorbed into the conversation, and we'll walk away thinking, I don't know what was happening, but that was worth doing. And you get there, as far as I'm concerned, you get there with truth. That's the pathway. Spoken truth.
Jordan, who are those names? You said mom, dad. Who else are some of those names that you go through?
Carl Jung was an unbelievably profound influence on me. Almost all the major psychotherapists, I read them deeply. Carl Rogers was real useful to me. Abraham Maslow, Freud, I read a lot of Freud. And then there's Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a huge influence. Friedrich Nietzsche, I read most of his major works when I was young. And then a large number of scientists, Jeffrey Gray, who's a neuroscientist, I what would you say, clawed my way through his work, which is very, very dense. It was extremely useful. He was a good model as a scientist. My mentor at McGill, Robert Peel, was someone who taught me a lot about administration and about giving credit where credit is due, and being comfortable in your own domain of competence. Like Bob, who I am still in regular contact with, Bob and I had different skills, and he was able to value my skills without ever feeling intimidated. And I could do the same with his skills, and that made our partnership extremely productive. And so that was very useful.
Are you familiar with Robert Greene's work, 40 Laws of Power, Art of Seduction, 33 Strategies of War?
Only as names. I haven't read his books.
Okay, got it. He wrote a book. His last book was Laws of Human Nature, and right after he finished his book, he had a stroke, and not the best kind of stroke. He had a terrible stroke, and his wife had to come and pick him up, and he couldn't walk. We did an interview one time with him. We had to push him in the wheelchair to get him. It took 30 minutes before we got ready to go through it. And I asked him a question. I said, how timely the fact, and every time he was working on the book, I said, how you doing? He says, you know what, I'm sick, and my mom's calling me, telling me, how's the book? I said, Mom, stop asking me about the book. I don't want to tell you about the book. The process of writing a book for somebody as technical as you're not writing a book like, here's the, 7 keys to success, work hard, all this other stuff that maybe you see. You kind of, your brain is, trying to get everything to be perfect. I remember one time I asked you a question about how do you research and how do you write? You said you write and you rewrite and you rewrite. I'm like, how many times do you write? So many times I have to write something on and rewrite. I'm like, wow, very detailed process you go through. How heavy is it on you when you write a book?
I think the only thing I've done that's as hard as writing is clinical work. It's the only thing that requires as much attention. It's unbelievably engaging, but it's unbelievably difficult. And well, I suppose to some degree it's as difficult as you make it, but I'm always trying to answer questions that I genuinely have, and I'm really trying to answer them. And I also, so I have a writing guide online for people who might be interested. You can find that, and it's an actually step-by-step guide through what you actually have to do if you want to write. It's not just hints about what constitutes good writing. It's a practice manual. And we're building a piece of software called Essay App that's designed to help people write better and therefore think better. But I mean, I have an analytic approach to writing to some degree, because I can write, but I also know what I'm doing when I'm writing. So imagine that a piece of work can be analyzed at multiple levels simultaneously. Did you select the right word? Did you select the right phrase? Did you organize the phrases into the proper sentences? Is each sentence as tightly written and carefully argued as it possibly could be? Are the sentences arranged properly in each paragraph? Are the paragraphs arranged properly in each section? Are the sections arranged properly within each larger unit? Does it cohere as a whole? Is it appropriate for the time and the place and the audience? Do the sentences sound poetic when you read them aloud? Do they have a rhythm? I'm trying to answer all those questions, not at the same time, but I try to answer all those questions with every single word I write. And I would say I write every sentence at least 10 or 15 times. And I mean, literally, I take the sentence, I put it on a separate page, and then I rewrite it multiple times, and then I pick the best sentence. And then when I do paragraph editing, I take the paragraph, put it on a separate page, break it into its sentences, rearrange the sentences in multiple variants, and then select the one that works the best. And I do that over and over. And so that's so it's demanding, because the more you get every single one of those things right, the more impact the work has, the clearer you've made the problem, and the more also the other thing, these are books that I've written, even though there are collections of essays, but each essay stands in relationship to the other essays. They're not independent units. They each add something to every other chapter. And so there's a meta meaning that emerges that's a consequence of the relationship between the essays. And I'm thinking about that as well when I'm writing and trying to organize the essays. And it's great for clarity of thought. And one of the things I loved about my conversation with Jocko Willink, because he's this very masculine, very tough man, very admirable person, but on the physical end of things, at least that's what you'd think. But he got an English degree after he was a Navy SEAL, and he did a 20-minute spontaneous proclamation about the unbelievable value of literacy to him, practically speaking. He said, well, he has to write out military strategy. He has to decode orders coming from above. He has to write up commendations for his men. He has to produce battlefield reports. He said he's nowhere at all as powerful as he could be without being literate. And literacy is the key to competence in a way that is just not properly communicated to young people. You're deadly if you're literate at everything. And it's because you can think and you can speak. I mean, what do you have that's more than that? There's nothing we have that's more than that. And writing sharpens your thinking. We're excited about this app. I'm really, it would be wonderful if we managed to contribute something to make the process of writing work better for people so that they can think more clearly. So what it does is it helps break down what you're writing into all these different sections. So there's like a sentence level of analysis and a paragraph level of analysis and so forth, so that you can concentrate on one part of the writing process at once, instead of trying to solve all the problems at the same time, which is so complex, it'll just bring you to a halt. So for example, you should write a really bad first draft with no care about grammar or any of that. Just get your ideas down. Doesn't even matter the order, but get the first draft down. And so you don't edit to begin with, you produce. And once you've produced, you can edit and then re-edit and so forth. But just separating those two things is extremely useful.
It's interesting you say this, because what's the story about you when a guy on Quora asked you a question about rules of life and you came up with 42, you posted it there and it got more shares and conversation, and it was, talked about, and that kind of led to the whole idea about your 12 rules of life and beyond,
Yeah, look
orders.
What came out of that.
Pretty powerful.
Absolutely. It's staggering, I mean, I spent about half an hour writing those, but I spent God only knows how long doing the background thinking that enabled me to write them. And the consequences of that were just
powerful. Creative thinking just led to what it led to today. So Jordan, let's talk about some of the stuff, current events on what's going on today. So you're not around, you're recovering, you're going through what you're going through. You're in Russia, you're in Florida. News comes out, Trump's being banned permanently by Twitter. Jack Dorsey announces that. Then it's Facebook. They don't say permanently, but they're kind of taking him down for now. YouTube says for now, but we'll see what's going to happen in the future. The only one that used the word permanently is Dorsey on Twitter. Okay. And, you know, you've been in the space of creating content for a while. Some of the stuff you've said, it's upset a few people. You had one legendary interview that did very well, where the lady was trying to spook you, and then next thing you know, it backfired on her, and you asked her a question and you said gotcha, and that kind of led to, you know, all these different things. And even some of the things that was going on in Toronto when you were a teacher, there was some challenges there with transgender, whatever was going on, and you came out and spoke up, and there was some kind of a debate that came up from that. But Trump being banned, Alex Jones a few years ago, Twitter, YouTube, InfoWars, hey, they're coming after you, they're doing this. Okay. What was your reaction when you heard about the fact that the 45th president of the United States was being banned permanently in a very powerful virtual government called Twitter?
Well, I thought that the companies who are doing such things have no idea what responsibility they're taking on. Because now they've announced their willingness, or maybe even their responsibility, depending on how you look at it, to police the content of what's being exchanged on their networks. Well, that's a rabbit hole that you, in all likelihood, don't want to go down. So you see attempts to censor emerging quite constantly now, and it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous. It's very upsetting that this happened to the president, to an elected president.
What's the, if you're someone who's well read, you've read history, what has been the consequences of silencing someone that has a big following? Who ends up paying a price long term? Is it the individual that silenced a Trump? Is it his following, or is it the silencer who eventually created more enemies that backfired on them long term? Who ends up losing long term?
Well, everybody does, I would say, because the classic defense for free speech is that, you know, if you limit someone's free speech, not only do you limit the rights of the person who's speaking, but you limit the rights of those who could have heard. And it seems to me that I believe that people have the intelligence to make up their own minds, and that they should have the information presented to them. My experience has been that people are far more intelligent and perspicacious than we generally assume. They come to the right conclusions. Who's to say? But you know, I don't think there's anything more important than freedom of speech. So
maybe let me ask the question a different way. So we have a lot of different issues that's being talked about right now. Things are interchanging. Obviously, we've kind of known what direction we're going. We have Joe Biden as our president.
I'd rather hear what Trump is thinking than not. I'd rather know than not. I'd rather see what's happening out in the public than not. I don't know what's going on underground now. I have no idea. And I know that, and no one knows what the impact of this has been on all the people who supported Trump. What are they supposed to conclude precisely from this? I'd rather these things were out in the open. I don't think that these companies had the right to do what they did. They had the right legally. They had the right, obviously, because they did it and they got away with it. But you know, there's a technological problem at the bottom of it too. We have all these new communication technologies, and we don't really know what the rules are. None of us do, including the people who run these social networks. It's not like they understand what they've created. How could you? No one can understand them, what you've created. You know, I was just talking to Michael Mellis the other day about 4chan. 4chan had some effect on the Hillary-Trump election. It's possible that 4chan tilted the election in favor of Trump because the margin was pretty small. But in any case, 4chan, in some sense, doesn't even exist. There's no centralized authority. There's no administrative bureaucracy. You can post there anonymously and your posts disappear. Well, we don't know anything about how to regulate a communications apparatus like that, or even how it should be regulated in principle, or even what it does or what it is. And so I have some sympathy for the giant media corporations because they're dealing with intractable problems. But I still believe that the censorship road is, well, it's likely to lead to a place that people don't want to go. So,
which is what?
Well, part of it's second guessing. You want to be able to say what you think. And if you have the voice of a hypothetical censor in your head, I mean, I've experienced this already. I've had guests on my show, like Abigail Schreier, who wrote a book on the trans issue, trans surgery in particular, gender reassignment surgery. And I was very nervous about having the discussion. So there was the little censor inside my head already operating. And when enough sensors operate in your head, then you can no longer think. And if you can no longer think, well, then you can't see and you're blind and you stumble into holes, and everyone stumbles into holes, and that's not good. And I've said over and over that if you're discussing something that matters, the probability that you're going to offend someone rises to virtual certainty. If the discussion you're having about an important issue isn't of sufficient potency to offend someone, then you're not saying anything at all. Well, then how many people should you offend, or can you offend before you're properly banned? You can say, well, a line was crossed because the president of the United States fomented armed insurrection. Well, had the situation been that clear, he would have been impeached. So there's ambiguity around the circumstances. And well, a line was obviously crossed. Well, what line exactly? And who's going to decide when it's crossed? Exactly. And this is very troublesome, but it's a problem we all have. Like, it's not a problem, in some sense, it's not a problem that Jack Dorsey has or Mark Zuckerberg. They're facing the same set of issues that the rest of it are facing. I mean, they have more authority over their platform, obviously, but it's not like there's a bunch of us out here who have the answer and they could just come asking. We're all facing this mystery, which is what our technological transformation of our means of communication, what it means and what we should do with it. It's very complicated. What should we do with, you're trying to answer that question all the time. What should you do with your podcast? What should you do with your YouTube channel? It's complicated. You have unlimited bandwidth and you have the opportunity to do anything you want and share it with hundreds of thousands of people. Okay, what should you do? You have enough money. And so, because one simple answer to a problem is, well, I'll do what makes money. It's like, okay, well, now you have the money. Okay, now what should you do? Well, it's complicated. Yep. It's really complicated. And so we need to talk about what we should do. And we are, in fact, doing that. So
that's right.
So that seems to be working.
So let me ask you this. Today, I feel like every decade, every era, there's a different set of problems. I don't even think it's an era. I think it's a decade. Like, maybe.
Sorry. I'd like to sit down with Trump and talk to him like I'm talking to you, because I want to know. I'd like to know what he's thinking. And I think everybody should know what he's thinking. And it isn't obvious to me that I could do a YouTube interview with Donald Trump and have it aired. And that seems to be a problem, because don't we want to know what he's thinking? Don't we want everyone else to see what he's thinking? Whether you're a foe or a friend, well, we should know. And I've been inviting politicians onto my show. It's like, come on for 2 hours and let's have a talk. It's not sound bites. It's an opportunity for you to reveal yourself. Can you? Will you? What happens when you do?
Has your camp ever reached out to him or no?
Not specifically to Trump. I've been reaching out to other politicians. I have Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee from Utah. I think we're releasing that next week. And he's the most conservative senator. And he comes about his conservatism honestly. He's a senator from Utah. And he acquitted himself rather well over the two and a half hour period. I'd like to see every politician do that. who are you? Like, there's enough time there for everyone to reveal their hand. And I think that's in everyone's best interest. And I believe there'll be more political leaders on my show in the future. We're pushing in that direction as hard as we can. Look, many politicians are unbelievably leery of long format. They don't understand it. They don't understand YouTube. They don't understand podcasts. They're still stuck in 1970, technologically speaking. And, they're worried about misstepping. But you can misstep by omission too. And YouTube, the long form podcasts allow politicians to bypass the gatekeepers, the media gatekeepers completely, and just talk to their constituents. Well, that'll revolutionize politics if people actually start to engage in it, I think. At least it has the possibility of that happening.
If you were to sit down with Trump, what would you be asking him right now?
I'd ask him what he thought about what happened in the Capitol in the day of the riots. What's his story about that?
He's addressed that.
What did he think?
Addressed that.
Yeah, but I'd like to go after it in depth. I'd like to ask him about who he think he thought he appealed to and why, and what he did that he thought worked. I'd like to ask him what he thinks about the accusations that pertain to his reprehensibility, his character, and what he thinks about that, and how he would respond to that. But I'd like to find out. Like, I wouldn't be interested in hurling accusations, or I'd like to find out what he thinks, because God, wouldn't you like to know what Trump thinks? I'd love to know what he thinks. We need to know, because half the population voted for him.
Why do you think opposition doesn't want you to know what he's thinking? What do you think they're scared of?
I think they're scared of all sorts of things. I think they're scared of the possibility that he has the power of a demagogue, that he's a populist, that he could harness the crowd for nefarious ends. They're concerned about his respect for democratic norms and the standard, what would you say, his respect for the authorities of the state. They view him as a Mussolini in the making, let's say. And so that's their fear. And, there are Mussolinis in the making, and Trump was a populist. And so that's where that fear comes from. There's also fear, of course, because some people think one way politically, and a lot of this is temperamentally based, and other people think another way, and it's hard for them to communicate across the divide. So that's some of the fear. But, it has to be addressed, because you in the US, there's this problem that 50% of this situation, 50% of the people voted for Trump. That can't just be swept under the rug. You can't sweep something like that under the rug, like, at all. And so what's going to be the consequence of stopping him from speaking? Why would you think that all the consequences of that are going to be good? I don't think they're going to be good. I mean, certainly a large part of the American population felt like they were punched by the large media companies, the large social media companies, because they were affiliated with Trump, and all of a sudden he was silenced. So all those people feel that they've been silenced. Well, they have been. Well, you might say, well, those are precisely the people who should be silenced. Is that what you think? You think 25% of your population should be silenced? Do you? What does that say about you? And what are you going to do with those 25%? You have to live with them. Christ, you're probably related to a bunch of them. So it's not a good solution, I don't think.
Does it backfire on him?
It always backfires. I mean, if you assume that, how could it not backfire? If investigating something complex is worthwhile, how could failure to investigate it not backfire? It's not like the conditions that gave rise to Trump are likely to magically vanish. And now it's possible that if Biden does a credible job, or even a great job, and I hope he does, that political temperature will lower, and this will become a non-issue, essentially. If we're lucky, it'll just fade away. And Trump is getting old too, and there is that blunt fact. And so maybe we'll just move on to other things. And it's possible that that might be the outcome we should hope for. But
What do you mean?
well, that we get on with the next thing,
Do you think that's a good thing? Because
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I wish Biden well. I hope he does a good job because he's your president. And wouldn't it be good if he did a good job? You guys need a good president. And maybe there are things that we should be focusing our attention on right here and now.
Yeah, I just think, like the topic of JFK assassination, right? So the JFK assassination topic till today, people want to figure out what really happened. The debate still steers it up every November 22nd. People, oh, well, this is what happened. No, that's what happened. No, this is what happened. No, it's really, this is what happened. No, now we have the real story. Movie after movie after movie after movie after movie.
Yeah,
We don't have any way to go get 100% definitive answer. Everything's going to be 82%, 92%, 63%. We're not going to get 100%, right? Trump is around right now. There's a lot to learn about what happened. And I'm not making it like when you're saying, let's move on. I don't mean move on like, well, he's going to die and move on. Not talking about that.
Look, I don't think things should be brushed under the rug. And I don't think that usually works. I've never seen it work.
Yeah, I think there's so much market research right now for us to find out about what's going to happen. If we don't figure out what really happened and the amount of power, like Clarence Thomas today came out and he said, he made some comments about Section 230. I don't know if you read that or I don't know if you heard about that, what he thinks about Section 230, the common carrier rules on Twitter. You may want to look it up because he kind of commented on it today. Mm-hmm. And it's creating frenzy. When Dennis Prager and I, who's a good friend of mine, I think he's also a good friend of yours. When Dennis
Prager's come under a fair bit of censorship pressure, which I'm not happy about.
Yes. And his wife, Sue, is a lawyer. When they went up against YouTube, they ended up losing because the court finally said, no, they have the right because the same rules that apply to government doesn't apply to a private company, because if they don't want to, they want to do whatever you want to, they can do it. They're not a government. They don't go based on the same rules of freedom of speech. They can do whatever they want to do. The government can't. The government's got to allow you to speak, right? And so I was speaking to a guy this last week who bought Metacoven. You may not know Metacoven. I don't know if you've been following NFTs or not. Metacoven is the guy who's a crypto billionaire who bought Beeple's every days for $69.3 million. And we were talking, I said, where do you live right now? He says, I live in Singapore. I said, why do you live in Singapore? You're Indian. Why Singapore? Why not US? He says, well, I lived in Canada. I lived in a few different places, UK, but I chose Singapore. I said, why not US? He smiles, and he's not a energetic speaker like the way he's not like that. He's very, calm the way he speaks. He says, I didn't want to go to US because US, they have fingerprints on you and it's like a web. They're going to figure out a way to get the taxes on you. He says, listen, I live in Singapore, zero in capital gains taxes. I said, zero. He says, zero. You don't pay any capital. I said, why would you pay capital gains taxes? Our ordinary income is 10 or 20%, no regulation. I don't have to, tell the government what I have and, hey, here's how much money I have. I don't want to tell anybody what I have, so I can keep it to myself. It's my business. If I go to US, I have to tell everybody what I have, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sitting there, I'm like, Singapore. Okay, interesting. Trump here, he's going through what he's going through. This guy's over here living free. And then he says, you have to realize that nowadays, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, these things are virtual governments. And they are controlling America. America's no longer what America used to be. America's a whole different America. So for us, if we don't get to the bottom of this today, I think a lot of people who have a voice are going to be bullied for decades. And I think we got to get to the bottom of it while, we have the ability to sit down, and Trump's got to be interviewed properly where someone's going to learn. The other day, his daughter-in-law interviewed him. Facebook took the interview down. I don't know if you saw that when Laura does the interview. So it would be very interesting to see someone like yourself interview him.
Yeah, well, I would love to do that. I think it would be, well, how could it fail to be anything but fascinating, at least for me, hopefully for people who are viewing it. It's a complicated problem, but my sense is that you tell people what's going on and let them figure it out. You can't hide it anyways. If it's real, you can't hide it. It comes out. You can't hide reality. It always comes out. And usually if you try to hide it, it comes out in a much worse form. That's my experience as a psychologist. I've never seen anyone successfully hide anything in their life. Not really. It leaks out in all sorts of ways. They don't necessarily even make the connection, but they can discover the connection later and be very sad about it.
How much of this has to do with your book, Beyond Order, rule number 6, abandon ideology? You think that's something that we are struggling with as a nation, especially America?
Well, people struggle with it all the time because we're attracted to oversimplifications, and it's no wonder, because the complexity of the world is daunting. And if you have a ready-made answer for almost everything, then that simplifies the landscape substantially. Some of it's just a matter of not being taught to think well. One of the things you learn if you're a social scientist, a research scientist, is that you generate, if you're looking at a complex phenomenon like male aggression, let's say, well, what causes male aggression? Well, the first thing you do is generate like 20 possible reasons. You don't limit yourself to the one you like. Like maybe I'm not that happy about TV. And so I think, well, TV violence probably makes men more violent. It doesn't, by the way. There's very little evidence that it does. There's quite a lot of evidence that it doesn't. Video games, because I think they're a waste of time. So they probably increase male aggression. It's like, well, no, they don't, as it turns out. Alcohol, that definitely increases aggression, male aggression and female aggression for that matter. So alcohol is a major contributor. Is it sociological? Is it cultural? Do you learn it? Is it biological? You generate all sorts of potential reasons. And you might also say, well, many of those reasons apply, not just one. And then you test them. And then the next thing you do, maybe you say, well, I want to decrease male aggression. Well, you don't assume that you know how to do that, and that if you do what you think you know, that it will work. That's all ideological thinking. The real world is way too complicated to be pushed around by that kind of thinking. And poverty, well, what causes poverty? Well, what do you mean by poverty? Well, you could think for 2 weeks about what poverty is, and you still wouldn't come to the end of it. Do you mean lower education? Do you mean lower intelligence? Do you mean lower conscientiousness? Do you mean drug and alcohol abuse? Do you mean lack of money? Do you mean absolute poverty? Do you mean relative poverty? Do you calculate that neighborhood by neighborhood or state by state? Do you mean poverty of hope? Do you mean lack of plan for the future? Et cetera, et cetera. And all of those questions, so you decompose, so you think, well, poverty is caused by lack of money. It's like, really, that's your theory, is it? Well, it's not good enough, that theory. It's not even close. And so part of that chapter is just an attempt to explain that most things that are truly problematic are so complex that no ideological solution can possibly suffice. It's just not a good way to go about the problem. And then there's the other problem too, which is that, well, one of the terrible temptations of an ideology is that once you parse out the world and have your reasons why problems exist. So let's say poverty exists because of capitalism, which is a completely idiotic theory. I mean, poverty exists because people are born with nothing, and it's hard to acquire goods. So the default state is poverty. So it's not caused by any sociological system. So it's foolish to begin with. But let's assume that you think that poverty, or at least relative poverty, is caused by capitalism. Well, then you have a convenient enemy. It's everyone who's a successful capitalist is now responsible for poverty, and then they're bad and you're good. And that's unearned moral virtue. And that's unbelievably attractive to acquire unearned moral virtue. Or maybe you're someone who's inherited your wealth, and then you think everyone who's poor is just lazy. And if they get up off their asses and get a job, that would solve the problem. It's like, well, that's convenient for you, but it's a very shallow analysis of the problem. And so it's not helpful to think that way unless what you want to do is not think.
Which is kind of where we are today, though, if you think about it. The less we think, the more we can be controlled. Just a crazy question for you strategically. I don't know if you think and say, as a, how Jocko likes to read about war, and his main, that's his interest because of what he did. He's a pretty deep thinker. His mind goes in very deep places on topics. But if you were to think like a strategist for a moment here, what are Democrats, not the left, What are Democrats trying to accomplish? We know what the left is trying to accomplish. Like, I'm not talking about AOC, Sanders. What are Democrats trying to accomplish right now? Like, what's their motive?
Well, look, if you look at Jonathan Haidt's research, one of the things you conclude, the psychologist from New York University, he's
Yeah.
looked at temperamental predictors of political belief.
Okay.
And the liberal types, the leftists, are concerned with fairness. Broadly speaking, it's what they orient themselves around. And a fair bit of that seems temperamental. The conservative types, this isn't Haidt's taxonomy precisely, but the conservative types are more concerned with order and justice and tradition. And those are all values, like there's utility in fairness, there's utility in justice, there's utility in tradition. Well, the devil's in the details, but broadly speaking, it's the issue of fairness. So, for example, I was talking to Russell Brand last week, and he's a lefty by temperament and intellectual proclivity. And I told him about all this research showing that if you look around the world, that the incidence of absolute privation has plummeted dramatically in the last 40 years. Well, really the last 200, but it's really been decreasing over the last 40 since the Soviet Union collapsed. So for example, now the typical sub-Saharan African has access to more calories than you need to maintain yourself. So enough calories, but also as many calories as the typical person in Portugal had in the 1960s. So in the poorest area on earth, there's enough food. No one starves anymore except for reasons of distribution and political oppression. It's great that that's the case. So absolute privation has decreased substantially. And you think, well, people could be partying in the streets because of that. And there's reasons that they aren't. But Russell's concern immediately was, well, what about relative deprivation? On average, people are much better, but there's a huge range. So some people are way better off than others, and some people are in a state of, they're just barely clinging onto the edge of the world. And of course, that's a problem. So you could imagine that the benevolent conservative types, and it's just an example, are pushing to have absolute privation decreased and are saying, well, look how well that's going. But the lefty types think, yeah, but you still got a distribution problem. And it's true. And relative poverty, absolute poverty is a catastrophe, but relative poverty is also a problem. Look, when you're walking down the street, you're a wealthy man. You're not happy to see homeless people. So, I've not met anyone who would say, well, who cares about homeless people? It's like, that's the price we pay for progress or whatever. No, if you could wave a magic wand and all of a sudden things would be different, well, then the homeless people would have enough of whatever it is that they need. But you don't know how to do that. And it isn't as simple as, well, they need more money. Well, so the lefties are more concerned about fairness. And there's a point to be made there. Now, fairness isn't everything. And that's the counter argument. So what are they up to? Well, then I would say, what are the Democrats up to? And I would say, well, they don't actually know. Because one of the things I was stunned by when I went to Washington, and I spent some time there talking to Congress people and watching, and I was stunned. There's virtually no formal policy-making apparatus in the political parties in the US. So what are they up to? They don't know, and they don't know how to communicate whatever it is they're up to. And so what happens, this is what's happened to the Democrats, and conservatives who are listening should know this, is that most of the Democrats are moderate centrists. The overwhelming majority of them are moderate centrists, and most of them, moderate centrist conservatives, would be perfectly happy with if they had a discussion with them. There'd be some minor sticking points, but they'd share much more in common than they would have in variance. Well, so why do the radicals have such a disproportionate voice? And the answer is simple. They have a compelling story, and the centrists don't. And then you might say, well, that's the centrist Democrats' problems. It's like, okay, what's the centrist Republican story? They don't have one either. And no real apparatus for generating one. It's stunning how much of a lack there is in that particular domain. I mean, formally speaking, no policy generating organization and no communication strategy. I couldn't believe it. It's unbelievable.
Where would you put Trump at?
Trump's an anomaly. He's his own weird thing. He's a trickster. And he was very good at that. I mean, look, he was a Democrat temperamentally for most of his life. Now, so I don't really know what to make of him. He certainly is a troublemaker by temperament to a fair degree, and a trickster. And that's part of the reason. I saw this T-shirt in Florida that really had a big impact on me when I was down there last year. It said, Trump in 2020 because fuck you twice. And I thought, yeah, there's something to that. And Trump tapped into that. And maybe he tapped into that because that's genuinely the way he feels. He also is not happy with the contempt of the educated elite, which was definitely something that working class Americans who supported Trump were reacting to. And I can certainly see that because I've seen among the educated literati, who parody what they think to be my audience, I've seen them deliver virtually nothing but contempt for my attempts to help that, angry white young male section of the population. They just have nothing but contempt for that. And a lot of Trump voters were responding to that. And Trump tapped into that extremely well. And I thought, Hillary lost because she abandoned her democratic first principles. I thought she abandoned the working class. She decided she'd go with the identity politics types instead of the working class. And I believe that sunk her, and rightly so. She deserved that royally. And I think the working class deserves a voice. They need a voice. They need dignified work and a place. That's not just handouts. It's not a solution. People need to be engaged productively, especially if they're conscientious, because their conscience will eat them if they're not.
I wonder if they're taking the topics, like sitting here saying, let's see which one of these we can win and which one of them we can't win. I wonder.
Oh, yes, they certainly do some of that, and they should. They should. That's actually a really positive part of the political process in a democracy. It's like, well, those politicians, they're always pandering to the polls. Well, you can do that stupidly, but you're supposed to pander to the polls. Those are your people. And, the wise political strategists that I'm in touch with, they look for issues that can be addressed positively, where there is concordance across both parties. And that's where they push, say, well, we seem to both agree on this, that this is useful, so let's do that. And that requires goodwill across the political table. And hopefully there's enough of that so that those sorts of things can be managed. I'm happy, I would say, with Biden's infrastructure goal. I think it beats the hell out of identity politics. And from what I know of infrastructure development, it's generally a wise investment calculated in terms of return on investment, if it's done without corruption and addressed intelligently. So that's how it looks to me.
Are you following what Janet Yellen's trying to do with get corporate taxes to be the same across the board with G20, where everybody has same corporate tax rate to eliminate tax competition? Those are her words yesterday. Are you aware of that or no?
No, I didn't. I hadn't seen that emerge yet. No.
What do you think about, competition? There's competition in different levels, right? Okay, here, Jordan Peterson, Beyond Order. Where's the competition on this? New York Times, ranked 5th, ranked 6th, ranked 1st, ranked 2nd, ranked 10th. You're not in the top 10. It's competition, right? So we got to write a better book. So we got to put a little more time and research to write a better book because there's so much pressure. I wrote 12 Rules of Life. Everyone's expecting for the second one to be better. I got to go compete. Okay, well, movies, competition, health, competition, marriage, competition. There is a small business. I got a small business. If I don't have better customer service and the right reviews online, Jordan, if you can, if I don't have the right reviews online, well, I may not have people come to my restaurant and I'm going to lose customers. Okay, great. And, competition and relationship, friendship. Well, I got to bring value to this relationship as well, or else eventually this guy's thinking is going to a different level and I may bore him eventually because I'm not elevating my level of thinking. I kind of got to bring value to this relationship as well. In every single thing, competition plays a good role in us bringing value. These guys are pitching the idea of meeting with G20 and telling them that, guys, why don't we all come up together with the same corporate tax rate? Because US has the current, one of the highest, if not the highest. They used to have the highest at 35. Trump brought it down to 21. Now they want to pitch it to bring it back to 28. It'd be the biggest, highest, I believe, in the world. Europe is like 9%, 10%, 12%. They have low corporate tax rate. A lot of them don't even have it. US gotten away with having it. Why are they so obsessed with trying to create competition for us, but eliminate competition for themselves? What benefit does that do for everybody?
Well, I suspect that they're trying to ensure that large corporations that are based in large part in the US and that benefit from, let's say, the US infrastructure aren't able to escape their corporate tax burden by shuffling their resources off to countries with a lower tax rate. That would be the goal. I mean, if it was just a positive goal, I mean, people are complex in their motivations, and maybe who knows how much of straight anti-capitalism is also motivating that, or irritation at corporations, et cetera, et cetera. But if you were looking for like a straightforward, relatively value neutral motivation, that would be it. Now, I don't have an opinion about that at the moment because I don't know enough about tax policy to formulate an intelligent opinion. I mean, your point you is a temperamental point, at least to some degree. You can see the value in competition, and so when you see that being eliminated, you see immediately what the disadvantages of that might be. And fair enough, it's a good rule of thumb. How it applies in this specific case, that's a really complicated problem. And I would, the way I would try to address it if I had to is I'd find 3 or 4 people who had spent their whole life studying this sort of thing, and I'd go interview them and listen to them, and build up a certain amount of knowledge if I could manage it, and then maybe risk an answer. I mean, it isn't obvious how to tax corporations, because on the one hand you say, well, look, if you tax them too heavily, they're going to go somewhere else, or you're going to stop people from producing corporations, which you definitely don't want to do. Obviously, there are levels of taxation that are counterproductively punitive, clearly. And then you might have a discussion about what the benefits are of taxation in general. And people have a wide range of opinions about that, and validly so. But the devil's always in the details. That's partly why I wrote chapter 6. It's like, look, these problems are complicated. You have to take them apart in detail, and beware of presuming that your ideological presumption is going to accurately reflect what the world is going to do. Very unlikely. It's very, very unlikely. I don't know what the corporate tax rate should be. I don't know. I have a corporation. I actually have several of them, and it's in my personal financial interest that the corporate tax remain low. Does that mean that I'm in favor of a lower corporate tax rate? Well, it does in that regard, but then I would say I also don't know enough about it in general to make a generalized conclusion.
We've had a lot of economists on, and we've interviewed a lot of guys to see, what their thoughts are, to kind of see this thing. But, when it comes down to taxes, as complex as it is, I think even the average person needs to spend more time studying taxes. It is a form of control. It is a form of, it's like working at a company. If you're working in sales, what's the first thing you need to know? You need to know your company's compensation structure. If I sell 20,000 computers to, Walmart's customer service, and I'm working for Dell, I probably got to know how much I'm going to get paid if I sell 20,000. I think some of the way the comp structure is being set up is, eliminating competition for themselves. That's my bigger concern long-term, because if incentive and innovation goes away the way it is today, what the hell am I creating anything for? Like, there's got to be some form of
well, that's. So look, I mean, my answer to that would be, if this seized me as an object of interest, and I felt that I wanted to know more about it, that it was an important topic, I would do what you have done. I would go find people to talk to and explore it. And all of the avenues. And there's many things that are valid to be said about that particular issue, and it's worth exploring. And then if I had the opportunity to guide people through that process, that would be good too. So, because then, at least in principle, we could all be more informed about it.
Jordan, final thoughts about your book, Beyond Order. Final thoughts. If you can tell us a little bit about your book here, how different is this from 12 Rules for Life?
Well, I would say I have a meta theory, I suppose. It's not precisely mine, but it's one that I've adopted. The Taoist philosophy is based on the same set of presuppositions. it's useful conceptually to divide the world into things that you can control and things that you can't. And that's roughly order and chaos. So order is where you are when the things you're doing are doing what you want them to do. You're comfortable there. That's explored territory. That's the family. That's the state. That's tradition. That's explored territory. Where you are when what you're doing doesn't work, well, that's upsetting and unexpected and chaotic. And that's the domain of nature, roughly speaking, symbolically speaking. The first book was about how to deal with an excess of chaos because it can swamp you. And the second book is how to deal with pathologies of order. And I would also say, conservatives are more concerned with an excess of chaos and managing it. Liberals are more concerned with an excess of order. But they're both right. Order can go dreadfully wrong. I mean, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the decisions of Facebook and Twitter, for example, to censor. We're concerned about that. That's a pathology of order. But the untrammeled world can go terribly wrong as well, which is why we erect complicated cultural structures to begin with. And so each book focuses broadly on one of those two domains, and hypothetically they make a nice matched set as a consequence. And so the first book tilted more towards individuality and anxiety, chaos, and disorder. But the second book tilts more towards communitarianism and the pathologies of tyranny and how that might be addressed. They both concentrate fundamentally, though, on solutions at the individual level. I'm a psychologist, not a sociologist, and I'm primarily interested in the level of the individual. What can you do, regardless of the pathologies of the state or the catastrophes of chaos? What steps can you take to improve your practical understanding of the world and to make your way more effectively, even in your own terms? And so that's the aim of both books. And I'm very pleased that people have responded very positively to the newest book, as they did to the previous one, but maybe somewhat more. And that surprises me because it was written under a lot of duress, and I wasn't sure at all that I had managed anything of any quality, because I wasn't acute enough often to be able to make that distinction. But I'm very pleased that, like, the public response on Amazon, I think there's several thousand reviews now, and they average out to 5 stars out of 5. And most people have said, if they compare the two books, that the second one is better. So I'm very pleased about that, and grateful to my readers, happy about its reception. And I do hope that it's helpful. That's what the goal was. That's the goal, man. It's like, make things better.
Well, that's definitely doing that, and you're not holding back in the book. For the person that reads it, you kind of go, here's what I'm going through. Here's what you're not at all holding back. It's a different read than the first one. On the cover of it, New York Times quote, I love how that's on the bottom. It says, the most influential public intellectual in the Western world right now. New York Times, specifically from New York Times. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for your time. Folks, if you're watching this, you can get the book. We're going to put the link below for you to go out there and order the book. I am looking forward to our next interaction, but until then, all the best to you.
Thank you very much for the discussion, and thank you to all of you who are watching and listening. It's much appreciated, and good luck to all of you.
No matter when I speak to him, this man makes you think, the way he processes issues and how he's thinking and processing out loud. So he's kind of, well, I would do it. And you just kind of follow him to see where his mind goes and where his brain takes him. But if you enjoyed today's interviews, there's 2 other interviews I did with him that are just as fascinating as this one. One of them I did in Dallas. It was the first one we ever did, where he talked about how he makes decision. If you've never seen this, very interesting. The other one is the clip that I showed where he was emotional. We did that interview in front of 7,000 or 8,000 people. If you've never seen that one, click over here to watch that interview. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.